Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Again, we're going to walk through the standards review process, both for the Kentucky Academic Standards for Science and for Social Studies. So just thank you again for making time and space to join us today to determine the sufficiency or deficiency of that process. And I'll start off. Again, my name is Mickey Ray. Our technology issues are coming up again. But as I was saying, my name is Mickey Ray, and I'm the Chief Academic Officer in the Office of Teaching and Learning. And the Division of Program Standards facilitates this work with our third-party American Institutes of Research. And so we are going to start by taking a look at the policy components that impact the work that we'll be discussing today. So if you take a look at KRS 158.6453, that is our standards review and assessment process statute. And within that statute, you can see that there are key components that the members of the advisory panels and review committee should actualize as they complete the process of standards review. And so those are listed on this for you. The law does require that this process commence every 6 years, beginning in 2017. And so we are to the point of the rotation with science, and that's where we will be beginning today. On the next slide, you can see the actual review process, and this was in line with your report that we shared with you. So we have walked through nearly all of the completion of this process for both science and social studies to this point. You can see we're in the last row where you as a committee determine if the process is sufficient or deficient for standards and assessment blueprint. We are hopeful that we will be able to take both of these regulations, both the science and social studies CAS documents, to the Kentucky Board of Education in December. And then once that's approved by the board, if approved, we enter into a 6 to 9 month regulatory process before the standards become effective and are implemented within Kentucky school districts. I'm going to switch over now to Sarah, if she's able to talk a little bit about the regulation. But if her technology is not working, then I'll speak to the reg. Sarah, are you with us?
Yes, I am. I'm going to close my door and get on camera. Thank you, everybody, for your patience with my technology issues this morning. It wouldn't be Monday without them. I am Sarah Peace. I'm the Policy Advisor for the Office of Teaching and Learning. It is so great to see you. And I assisted with the regulatory changes for science. We're starting with science and we'll go to social studies. 704 KAR 8120 is a new regulation. Previously, let me back up. This is a new administrative regulation. It will stand on its own under Chapter 8. And it will hopefully, after this process, be able to go to the board for a vote to become law.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, and if we take a little look at the next slide, so I wanted to talk about the timeline, and this was atypical for science, and I know many of you are familiar with our standards review process timelines, but for science, you'll notice here, it actually began in October of 2020. Usually a standards review process lasts approximately 2 years, so it takes the advisory panel review committee about a year to do the work with the public comment periods of reviewing and revising standards. And then there's, again, that 6 to 9 month period that's involved in the legislative process after approval by the KBE. But the committees for science review faced many challenges, as you well know. So the process was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. There were devastating natural disasters within our state during the time. And then we're also facing challenges with having a quorum due to substitute shortages and people not being able to be away from their classrooms to attend these sorts of meetings to do the actual work of standards review. So we're so thankful for the commitment of the Kentucky Academic Standards for Science advisory panels and review committee. It was an extensive process. It was a demanding timeline. And so now I want to transition to Crystal Rowland, who's the director of the Division of Program Standards, and she's going to get a little bit more into the weeds on what the committee process actually looked like for science. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, Mickey. As Mickey mentioned, I'm Crystal Rowland, and I'm the director of the Division of Program Standards. So we're going to dive in a little bit around the actual process and what was achieved by the advisory panels and review committee. So the advisory panels and review committees developed guiding principles to anchor their work early in the review process. These guiding principles include the ideas presented here on the screen and represent a commitment to clear standards with opportunities for students to engage deeply with science, to deepen their learning and make sense of the natural world. An alignment to evidence-based and developmentally appropriate instruction that is supported through a vertical progression across grade levels and through teachers' access to ongoing high-quality professional learning and resources. So the Region 5 Comprehensive Center created a public survey detailing the current Kentucky academic standards for science to solicit feedback from the public. This third-party organization created, monitored, and facilitated the survey, providing the Kentucky Department of Education with a web link for the general public to access the survey. The KDE advertised the survey link to all stakeholders, including Kentucky educational organizations and partners, regional education cooperatives and advisory committees, via the Education Commissioner's weekly emails, formal public press release, Kentucky teacher website, the KDE website, and various multimedia outlets. The public was given 30 calendar days to provide feedback regarding the current Kentucky academic standards for science. The American Institutes for Research, as Mickey mentioned, AIR for short, worked to compile all the survey results collected by the Region 5 Comprehensive Center and created a finalized stakeholder survey report that was shared with the members of the advisory panels and the review committee. On the screen, you can see that we had a variety of education and community stakeholders participate in the survey. The vast majority of those were teachers. In the initial survey, not all respondents commented on all performance expectations, and most had no suggested changes to the performance expectations. You have a link to all survey reports for both science and social studies in your SAPRC report. The advisory panels convened to discuss public feedback and possible changes to the Kentucky academic standards for science. To make these determinations, advisory panel members were provided with the survey report, current research related to their content-specific standards, other state standards, crosswalks, and research-based standards frameworks to help inform and guide changes and adjustments. The proposed changes to the standards document were then submitted to the review committee for consideration. The review committee members were also provided with those same materials, the survey, the current research related to science standards, other state standards, crosswalks, as well as research-based standards frameworks to help inform and guide the changes and adjustments regarding the current CAS for science. Upon review of the materials, the review committee made revisions and changes to the standards accordingly, creating a revised draft of the CAS for science. The draft standards were then submitted to AIR for the creation of a public comment survey. So again, the third-party AIR created a public survey once again, this time detailing the newly revised draft CAS for science. They created, monitored, and facilitated the survey and provided KDE with the web link for advertisement to the general public. So KDE advertised the survey link to all stakeholders, including the Kentucky educational organizations and partners, regional education cooperatives, advisory committees, the Education Commissioner's weekly emails, formal public press release was created and shared, the Kentucky teacher website, KDE website, and various multimedia outlets. And the public was again given 30 calendar days to provide feedback on the recommended revisions to the CAS for science. AIR compiled all survey results and comments, providing the KDE with a finalized stakeholder survey report that was shared with the review committee and advisory panels. As you can see, there were a variety of education and community stakeholders represented in that survey data as well, just over half of those respondents being teachers. Represented here is the feedback received on the draft Kentucky Academic Standards for Science. As you can see, a vast majority of the responders had no proposed changes or comments at all. In K-5, 87% of respondents recommended no changes, and that was 92% in middle school grades and 89% in high school. In addition to this survey, AIR conducted a number of focus groups seen here on your screen. The advisory panels reconvened to discuss any final changes they deemed appropriate to the draft CAS for Science based upon the public feedback collected by the AIR. Any additional changes or adjustments to the draft standards were then submitted to the review committee for review and consideration. The review committee also received the finalized stakeholder survey report for the draft CAS for Science in conjunction with the advisory panel's final recommendations to help inform any final changes and adjustments needed to the draft CAS for Science. The review committee made revisions and changes to the standards accordingly, creating a final draft for submission and review of the Interim Joint Committee on Education. The proposed draft CAS for Science includes a redesign of the architecture to provide more clarity on the standards expectation for the grade level, and this was a concern that was elevated through the feedback process on the current standards. The redesign layout, as shown here, includes the performance expectation, supported by a clarification statement that provides examples and additional information, as well as an assessment boundary, providing limitations for large-scale assessments. Further information is provided within foundation boxes, which show the science and engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts that combine to develop that performance expectation. And I will pass it on to Rhonda to speak about the alignment of science assessment blueprint.
Rhonda, I believe you're muted.
You're muted.
The blueprint is also in statute required to follow the same process as the science standards. It is a much smaller set of information. The blueprint gives the relative emphasis of the broad content areas of science, the domains. And let's see, I've requested control. Let's see if that pops up. If not, I may need someone to. So I think Crystal or someone, do you have control of the screen?
I allowed control. Is it not showing you where you can click forward?
I think, let's try this. See. You see if it'll click for you. I apologize again for our technology issue. If it clicks forward, who has control? And I'm fine for someone to keep control. If we want to just back up, I'll just tell you when to advance. That's only a few slides.
I have a backup copy to switch to PowerPoint Live if need be as well.
Okay, so Ben, are you able to just move forward, or I'm not sure again who is in control at the moment?
I'll just put the live version up real fast.
Okay, that sounds fine. And then Ben, I'll just direct you to move forward because there's only a few slides here.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, is that okay? That was Ben Riley, who is our wonderful tech support person here in Assessment and Accountability. Thank you, Ben, very much for the good save. So we want to talk a little bit about the blueprint work. We'll in a moment pop onto the slide that gives you the KRS or statutory number. The department shall implement a process for reviewing the academic standards and the alignment of corresponding assessments for any possible revision or replacement. the process that requires the standards, and you saw this earlier in the presentation, early in the slide, we enter that process on the very, we basically start as we start into the second column. And you will notice where at the bottom of the second column, assessment blueprint is added by the word standards. And so the very first round of public feedback was only on the standards. Then once the standards start moving forward, we joined the process to also then have the recommendations for the emphasis to be in the test of the academic content of science. And so you can see beginning at the bottom of that second column, that the standards blueprint process became part of the system. We also contracted with AIR to be a third-party check to receive feedback and to put that out for a survey result. So Ben, if we go to the next slide, and I think you actually have to move forward. We're up to the slides.
Should be slide 18.
18. Slide 18. So Ben, we'll let you catch up there and move to slide 18. Thank you, Mickey. I couldn't see the number on my small version here. So as we look at what results we saw for the accountability blueprint, we didn't have as many teachers and individuals respond to the blueprint, but again, it's not as elaborate a document. It is only really a small chart to indicate what weight should be on life science, what weight should be on physical science, engineering practice concepts, and earth space science. And but you can see primarily teachers are those giving feedback with 47.74%, followed pretty closely by, I think, administrators in terms of the number, and those in other support roles in the school. We did have people who did not respond. They went out into the survey but did not respond, or were not a Kentuckian in that survey process. So as we go to slide 19, let's look a little bit about what we heard in the public feedback. The first bullet there, most people who responded, greater than 75%, when they were considering the big categories of science of physical, life, space, and earth and space science, and then 69% around the engineering design, identified the blueprint domains and felt like it communicated the content being assessed. So initially, there was a lot of agreement around the blueprint and the division across the content across the testing process. The target percentage for grade 4, people were asked, is it just right? Should it be lower? Should it be higher? You can see the category there, the greater percentage stated physical science, and earth space is just right or should be a little lower, and life is just right or should be a little higher, and engineering was just right. So following that same pattern, we saw 7th grade teachers and others that were interested in the 7th grade science that responded, again, had just right or lower on the physical science, life science, earth space, and engineering, just right or a little higher. And you can see the bullet for grade 11 and the process there as well. Most respondents stated the document is easy to read. They understood there, but some disagreement that it provides enough instructional guidance. Again, it's really about clarifying when we develop an assessment with Kentucky teachers, what relative emphasis should be in the assessment across these broad content areas. So as we go to slide 20, the process did yield some suggestions, 2 changes for the assessment blueprint. One is really informational. The request was to add additional language and a hyperlink to the blueprint when it lives on the online environment to connect to release items for science. So teachers can see how the multidimensional quality of the science assessment shows up in release test items, and then have a little bit greater understanding about how this appears in the testing process. At grade 7, the lower boundary, there is a range of the target for each of these content areas. The lower boundary was changed to 20%, and they felt that better reflected the content as it was being addressed in grade 7. So most often I would summarize to say that for those that gave feedback on the blueprint, most were in agreement to the majority of the blueprint as it existed. As they looked at the changes to the science and how do we need to reflect that in a new revised blueprint, the only 2 suggestions for change are the 2 that are in front of you on slide 20. And I believe at this point, we will move to the science and the interim joint education committee feedback.
Thank you, Rhonda. And I'll speak to that just briefly. So we did appear before the Interim Joint Committee on Education on October the 18th to present the Kentucky Academic Standards for Science draft, as well as the assessment blueprint. And this is covered in your report, but we did want to talk a little bit about the feedback that we received based on that. So if someone could go to the next slide. You can see that some of the committee members, they did ask about the process for choosing the applicants for the advisory panels and review committee, and they wanted to ensure that there was statewide representation of the members. And so we talked a little bit about the CASAB that's utilized and how we do pull from the 8 educational cooperative regions to ensure representation from across the state. They also asked the KDE to consider ways to involve more community members in the public feedback survey. And that is something that we are always working toward. We know that feedback makes the process better. And at this point, we're utilizing all of the KDE media outlets to do so. And so we're certainly open to suggestions or recommendations on how we can elicit increased response on the public surveys that are put out for standards review and that assessment blueprint review. And then lastly, you can see we discussed how to increase those number of comments. Again, the goal is ensuring diverse feedback from across the state. There was no additional public comment on this state, and so the meeting ended, and they knew that we would be speaking with you on November 21st and hoping to go before the board in December. Okay, so the next slide is just a placeholder for questions that you as committee members may have regarding the Kentucky Academic Standards for Science and or that aligned assessment blueprint. So any questions from the committee at this point around the process associated with science or any of the information included in your report for science? Yes, Ms. Burnside. And I believe you're muted. Oh, there we go. We can hear you.
Oh, good. I like to comment on that second point you were making about how to get more public input on there. So I wonder if, as you utilize the KDE resources, if there could be more of a small team component to actually collaborate with some of the organizations that are in the various areas of Kentucky to get a part of their regular meeting agenda to have them participate in some of the items at the meeting. So it really brings it alive, makes it interactionist for them, and creates, I think, models the kind of involvement that we're going to need as we go forward, continuing to make modifications on the assessment over the years.
I do appreciate that. I think that would give a reserved space and time for people to actually engage with the survey in the way that they would feel comfortable, whether that's just the elementary band, middle school band, or high school band, or potentially the full K through 12 survey. So thank you for that. We certainly will make note of that.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments or questions related to science? Yes, Ms. Smith, please.
Hi, I have a question about the draft for public comment period. I think it's the second draft because the teacher portion went from over 400 teachers participating to only 119. And one thing that I'm curious about is the date that that happened, because if I know with social studies, which we're getting to, one of those public comment periods is during September when teachers are very, very busy. And so if we want to increase that participation, I think we've got to work on the timing possibly. So I don't remember what the timing was for that, but that's just one thought that I had.
And Crystal, can you clarify the 30-day window for the draft survey?
Yes, I believe that was out during this summer.
So clearly that would be part of the issue, and people needing to have a brain break from those things associated with standards in general. I think part of the issue is because the process is so extensive, we have to hit those periods where we're able, but I think we can try to look for ways of being more intentional, not only to communicate it better with stakeholders, but to find space and time when it would be easier, if there ever is an easier time for people to have the ability to actually get into the survey and respond. I don't know, Rhonda, is there anything you would like to add on that?
I agree. And I do think a little bit of the timing is sort of set forth in the statute, that we do have to complete some processes within a particular time frame. And I think that, I'm not sure that came into play for all the areas, but I think it did for maybe social studies. But we do have to kind of meet the statutory requirements. I think also one of the things that kind of pushed the timing a little bit odd is we mentioned early with our time with you today that achieving quorum became quite difficult at times. I think people were trying to balance COVID, balance doing both in-person and virtual types of instruction. It just feeling, I'm sure, overcommitted. And so we had trouble many times achieving quorum. And it's just as we went through that process with you today, without quorum, the work could not move forward. Meetings would have to be rescheduled. So I think that also came into play a little bit as well. I saw some of my colleagues nodding affirmatively to that. But I think it's an excellent suggestion, Mrs. Burnside, and I do think we need to see how best we can make that happen. Especially, I think there are committees that are naturally interested in particular content areas because the teachers are in support of those content areas. And I'm certainly, we've had some people from our Science Association involved in the process, but certainly to do something more formalized, I think would help just keep everybody focused on completing the survey.
Would you, let me hold my finger up here. Would you be able to contract for assistance? Like, for example, I'm thinking of a outreach agency that some of you may have heard of, the Brushy Fork Institute. They're an outreach from Brewery College Appalachian Initiative. And one of the things that they've been working on for the past 3 decades is ways to get community members involved who normally may not see themselves as taking an active role, but they do have the interest. And once they're able to be invited out or facilitated for them to participate, then they really take off from there. So if that could be an agency that you might contact to see in some way if they could facilitate this part of getting the community involved, I think that could be a win-win.
But I'm not familiar with the agency, so I appreciate that learning today. I'm certainly familiar with Brewery College and the fine work that people do there. So I think we would just, my initial thought is we would just have to see how that worked within the requirement of a third-party vendor that we have to have in statutory language. And of course, AIR was the contract that did that third party. Whether or not a group that you mentioned could be subcontracted with that third-party vendor to help get the word out, or maybe we would go through certain agencies to say, can you help us get the word out? I think part of it is at what level the group that you mentioned at Berea would be involved. Would they actually be doing something very formalized, or would they be using their network to kind of push out the information to say, hey, are you aware this is going on? Here's how you can be involved. Here's how the survey. So I appreciate having that suggestion, but I think we would have to kind of just go back and look at the legal contractual kinds of things we have to do to follow the statute. And that's just my initial off the top of my head thinking. And I know Mickey or Crystal or others, you may have something you'd want to add to that.
Well, low-hanging fruit could be that they could push out some of the information you're trying to get out to some of the people that you're in contact with. And then it wouldn't need to be any formal contractual arrangement, but just, that would be really good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good suggestion.
And I agree, we're going to have to be more creative about the way that we are utilizing partners to ensure that more people have access to the survey so that we're getting quality feedback from across the state. So I greatly appreciate the recommendations, and that's something that we will be committed to seeking out, beyond just the educational co-ops who tend to serve as our primary mechanism of sharing of communications. So thank you for that. Any further questions before we move on to the Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies? Okay, well, we are going to then transition to our discussion around social studies. And Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the regulatory component behind this.
Thank you. The Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies were scheduled to be revised in 2025, but due to the passage of the American Principles Act that is now in statute under 158.196, required an earlier revision process to meet the July 1st deadline of 2023 in the incorporation of foundational documents. And I believe Mickey will be able to give you a little bit more detail about the statute.
Thank you, Sarah. So the difference between science and social studies is quite significant in terms of what precipitated the review. For science, they were scheduled to undergo the full CAS revision and move them from KR 704-3303 into a new Chapter 8 regulation. Social studies will go through that full review process still in 2025, but this was a very specific opening of the regulation per, as Sarah mentioned, KRS 158.196, to incorporate the fundamental American documents and speeches into middle school and high school academic standards and aligned assessments by July 1, 2023. So that was wording within the statute. We were bound by that July 1 date, and this revision shall not delay or otherwise impact the existing schedule of KRS 158.6453, which is what science review was used to open up that regulation for the full review process. So again, social studies will undergo the full review in 2025. For this one on the next slide, and I'm not going to read all of these pieces to you, but these were the 24 fundamental documents and speeches that were embedded within the Teaching American Principles Act and KRS 158.196 that the Academic Standards Writers for Social Studies Advisory Panel and Review Committee had to consider in order to incorporate those into the CAS for Social Studies. So these were the 24 pieces that they were charged with incorporating. And I'll give you just a second to kind of glance over that. And then on the next slide, that gives you the timeline. So that bill was signed into law in April of 2022, and we moved immediately to reconvene the advisory panels and review committee for social studies in June. They actually met in July of 2022, July 14th and 15th. They came together to begin that incorporation. And Crystal's going to talk a little bit more about some of the choices that they made initially, but I just wanted you to see that this is an accelerated timeline for us. So because of that July 1, 2023 deadline, we knew we had to be before the Kentucky Board of Education in December in order to have the 6 to 9 month window to meet that July 1 date. So it was a very pressing timeline. And to this point, we have been able to stay on track. And again, our goal is to have the standards for social studies before the Kentucky Board of Education in December as listed there. And so, Crystal, if you'll talk a little bit about the initial changes that were made by the committees.
So, as Vicki mentioned, the CAS for Social Studies implementation timeline required the reconvening of the Social Studies Review Committee and Advisory Panel members who participated in the 2019 revision, along with new committee members that were added as needed for those who had changed roles since 2019. Advisory panel members reviewed the requirements provided in KRS 158.196 and provided recommendations to the review committee for consideration. Within the CAS for Social Studies, there are standards and clarification statements. The standards represent goals or learning outcomes of an educational program. Standards are vertically aligned, expected outcomes for all students. The disciplinary clarifications include content and concepts to help teachers better understand the expectations of the standards. And initially, the advisory panels voted to embed the fundamental documents and speeches into the clarification statements where appropriate to help support teachers in implementing them across existing standards. Upon review of the advisory panel's recommended changes, the review committee voted to accept the revisions to the standards, creating a revised draft of the CAS for Social Studies. The draft standards were then submitted to AIR for the creation of a public comment survey. AIR created, monitored, and facilitated the survey, providing the KDE with web links for advertisement to the general public. And again, the KDE advertised the survey link to all stakeholders, including Kentucky educational organizations and partners, regional education cooperatives and advisory committees, via the Education Commissioner's weekly emails, formal public press release, and Kentucky Teacher website, KDE website, and various multimedia outlets. The public was given 30 calendar days to provide feedback on the recommended revisions to the draft CAS for Social Studies. The AIR compiled all survey results and comments, providing the KDE with a finalized stakeholder survey report for social studies that was then shared with the review committee and advisory panels. As you can see, we received feedback from a variety of education and community stakeholders, and the largest group being teachers at 69%. The overwhelming majority agreed with or were neutral on the standards as revised by the committee. The disagreement was typically around the fact that the documents were placed in the clarification statements rather than in the standards themselves. This disagreement was addressed by the advisory panels and review committee when reviewing the public data. The RC and AP were reconvened to discuss any final changes they deemed appropriate to the draft CAS for Social Studies based upon the public feedback collected by the AIR. Any additional changes or adjustments to the draft standards were submitted to the RC for review and consideration. So the advisory panel and review committee recognized this 5th grade standard as being mentioned as a model standard considered by those in favor of the Teaching American Principles Act. They revised this standard to replace foundational documents with the term fundamental documents to align to the statute and build coherence to the newly designed middle school and high school standards. After reviewing the stakeholder survey report and public comment received during the open comment period, the advisory panels addressed the concern around the fundamental documents needing to be included in the standard statements rather than the clarification statements. So the advisory panel created a new standard for 8th grade that is time-bound for the grade level appropriate standards, and that includes the documents from that time period by name within the standard. In addition, The advisory panel created a new standard for high school that is time-bound for the grade level appropriate standards, and that includes the fundamental documents from that time period by name within the standard. Oh, Mickey, you're on mute.
Thank you, Crystal. I was saying once that draft document was completed, we did appear before the Interim Joint Committee on Education for feedback on November 1st of 2022. And at that meeting, I wanted to share some of the feedback that we gathered. We did have to discuss the impact of that July 1, 2023 deadline, which was required by the statute. Once again, as you all already know and have anticipated, they had questions concerning the community stakeholder feedback. So they were seeing that we are getting responses from educators, but they were wanting to look to see how we could encourage feedback beyond just educators. They also asked us to consider ways in which, in general, more community members could participate, and they inquired related to the representation from across the state to once again ensure diverse feedback. And that was both in connection to the membership of the advisory panels and review committee, but also the respondents to the survey itself. We did have one public comment in addition to the KDE presentation that day, and that actual messaging was shared with you via email. And the way that we were able to address that within the Interim Joint Committee is that, again, this statute required us to open the CAS for social studies outside of the regular 6-year cycle. And because we have that July 1, 2023 deadline, we had to accelerate that timeline and move very quickly to make the incorporations of these documents into the CAS. But we certainly in 2025 would be able to meet much of the concern of that commenter in terms of the recommended resources that should be shared with the advisory panels and review committee moving forward under a full review of the Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies. And so now we want to make sure that we have time for discussion by the committee, any questions that you may have specifically about social studies. Again, in general, if you all find the process for both sufficient today, they will go to the board in December 6th. And then after that, upon approval, they would have a 6 to 9 month process of just regulatory process before they would be implemented in 2023. So any questions from the committee regarding the CAS for social studies?
A couple of questions. One would be, when they changed from foundational to fundamental, was there understanding about what meaning each term had compared to the other one, and were they giving up something that they didn't intend to?
So that the use of the word fundamental was in statute, and so that language had to be pulled over. But Crystal, is there anything that you would like to add? And I know we also have Lauren Galicchio with us today, our social studies consultant, who may want to speak a bit more to the discussions had by the advisory panels.
So I can start. So the advisory panel, to your point, did really discuss the terms fundamental versus foundational. They did, as Mickey mentioned, they did land on fundamental for a couple of reasons. One, what fundamental means within the field. They looked at that term used across a variety of social studies situations, experiences, and the law itself. They also, one of the supporting documents that we have on kystandards.org is the glossary for the CAS for social studies, and that is an additional resource to support the implementation of the CAS for social studies. They have revised that document to include the definition of fundamental to ensure that there is clarity regarding that word and that change in the document.
Thank you, Lauren.
Their revision of the word fundamental, then, would it allow them to include a document or speech or treaty with the Native American nations who were here in the foundational beginning of the country, because the list of 24 starts with the Mayflower Compact. But we know there were Native groups that were writing and speaking and communicating with the colonial government in those early years.
Absolutely. And if we can go back to one of the standard slides, the one thing I want to point out, so those 24 documents, again, were required in the law, but they always include the language. And if I can have the, it does say, yeah, including but not limited to, but let's show that for middle school and high school as well. So in each of the new standards, it says including but not limited to the following documents. So there are other standards, of course, beyond these two that would connect to diverse groups, and they would be able to bring those in addition to the requirement that's found within the Teaching American Principles Act.
Then would this particular list be shorter if the same expectations that they could be included but not limited to on that? And the fact that it's starting at 1,600 instead of maybe 1,400.
I don't know, Lauren, do you want to address the time-bound nature of that grade 8 standard?
Yes, so to get an understanding why the 8th grade is time-bound, is we need to take a step back and understand the overall construction of the entire CAS for social studies. So K-8 is divided up among themes. High school has its own time-bound as well. But if you see there, 8th grade, it does go from 1600 to 1877. And the writing committee took the portion of the 24 documents that applied to 8th grade in particular, and that is basically about the founding of the United States and going all the way up through Reconstruction. They assigned those standards to that grade level. Because this is a law, that law does require that those documents are taught. And so the standards writers put that into that new standard. Same thing here you see with high school. High school is also time-bound. It's 1877 to the present. And that's why you see these particular documents appearing in the high school U.S. history strand.
Lauren, is it though in elementary, is it grade 5 in which they would discuss earlier groups in North America at that time? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, so in elementary school, on grades 4 and 5, they do go into a historical dive into the development of the United States. Grade 4 is migration and movement, and then grade 5 is colonization to constitution. But it is also important to note that the writers of the CAS for Social Studies are committed to students understanding the diversity that is found within the world. And so within those different grade bands and timeframes, students are looking at the entire world as it develops, basically, depending on the year, from the earliest to the present day.
That sounds marvelous.
The process, and again, this is my bias, but having undergone multiple rounds of review for the Kentucky Academic Standards, the process truly does work, and it's always helpful for us to have the feedback from those advisory panels, those teachers who are in classrooms, and connections to community and higher ed representatives as well, across all of the content areas. And social studies, as you might expect, can sometimes be challenging, but they always have the best interests of students in mind. And it's a privilege to be able to partner with them and to see the good work that's done by the advisory panels and review committees. Any additional questions or comments?
I have one question.
Yes, Dr. Stacey, thank you.
All right, seeing how I didn't go through the whole process, mine's more of a oversight. So I would just ask if Commissioner Glass or whoever the highest representative for KD is to respond. Do you all feel like that we, throughout this process, you've done everything that needed to be done with both committees? to check off all of the requirements in the standard review for science and the new expectations for the social studies curriculum.
And Rhonda, I would love for you to talk about that for the assessment blueprint. But in terms of the standards process for science and social studies, I feel like that the report that's been shared with you is certainly self-evident that the process was followed and that we've ensured that each step of that was accurately communicated to stakeholders across the state as well.
And
Yes,
Dr.
Mickey,
Stacy,
and I was going to say, Dr. Woods Tucker, would you like to weigh in?
well, I am learning this process, one moving from that of a practitioner like Dr. Stacy and had an opportunity as a former superintendent and curriculum director to do this, but really learning from this. But I always learn from everyone on this call, especially from you, Rhonda, as our associate commissioner on the assessment side, and of course, Mickey Ray as our chief academic officer. And Mike, as a former superintendent and curriculum director, I'm impressed with the process, and certainly, I'll follow Rhonda and Mickey anywhere. They're top notch. Mickey and Rhonda, anything else you all want to add regarding the process?
Thank you, Dr. Woodstucker. I will mention that for the blueprint, we felt very positive about how it was handled this year compared to the prior experience. We actually we took an extra year and ran it as a totally separate process. And the concern with that is that the people who are most involved with reading the comments and working through the process on the standards were not all the same people that were involved with discussing the blueprint. And it's and also it delayed the ability to really get a test underway by about a year. So as we went back and looked at the statute, we thought it was a much more efficient process to run these sort of side by side, so that we make sure we cover all the steps. We felt like we were doing the steps in the previous iteration of this with another content area, but we think this is a much more efficient process, and it makes the folks that are the most knowledgeable members of the various committees and who've had most opportunity to read all the public comments, be able to also then evaluate what does this standard mean as we move over to its relative weight in the assessment. So I feel very positive about that as well. I think we've all been very careful to try to make sure we meet all the steps and fit that in between, I would say, the broad bookends of the timeframes we were required to meet as well. And again, we would love to have had it fall more naturally. I know one of our comments would have loved to have it fall more naturally when teachers weren't as busy, but unfortunately that was not able to happen as much as we'd wanted to this time around. But I do feel like we have done that.
All right, thank you very much. That's all I have.
And I guess one other thing I would add, and it's something I worked with through the Office of Teaching and Learning that both Mickey and Rhonda pointed out. As you know, Dr. Stacy and others, AIR, the American Institute for Research, is well known for developing high quality assessments, but they are also in the arena of facilitating the standards review process. And as I've learned through working with Mickey and Rhonda, AIR per the statute could not do both. So you have a fantastic checks and balance system where they are facilitating with the standards review process, but they are not creating the assessment. But it's such a bonus to work with a group like AIR that has a long history of developing high quality assessments.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
I don't want to limit the discussion or the questions that you may have from the members of the committee, but I also want to honor your time as well. So if there are not more, then Sarah, we can transition over to you for next steps. But anything else before we shift? All right, Sarah, if you'll talk about our next steps.
Hello again. In terms of next steps, the two most important things I wanted to be sure to mention is that if you needed a substitute at any point, remember to fill out the reimbursement form and we'll get those taken care of and they can be sent back to me. My email address is included in our communication. Then also, we sent you a findings report form. This is a required form to be completed by everyone who is present today, and it will indicate the sufficiency in which KDE followed the standards review process. It is a 2-page document. 1 page is for social studies and 1 page is for science. And so I would ask that before we finish up, and I'm very happy to see we're ahead of schedule, could you please go ahead and access that document, the findings report form? If you do not have it handy, I can drop it in the chat for you if needed. I can also drop my email address in the chat as well. That is what I would like for you to use to send back both the sub-reimbursement forms and the finding report forms.
And Sarah, we do need a findings report from each member of the committee for each content area, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
That's what I heard you say.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And these will be part of what we provide to the Board of Education. Would anyone like for me to provide the document or my email address, Sarah Peace?
Yes, please, Sarah. I've checked my email. I don't know if it went to junk or not, but I don't see it under your name. So if you can drop it in the chat, that would be great.
Yes, and it may be under Mickey Ray's name. She did send some pieces in the evening, but I want to go ahead. I'll add those into the chat, make it a little easier to be at the top of your inbox.
And Michael sent some.
That was right. Yes.
Michael Hackworth.
Yes.
So it may
yes,
be under Michael Hackworth's email.
Thank you.
And again, you'll notice at the bottom, there's a findings acknowledgement of the page. And so you would just check the box that you feel comfortable with. And then I think the signature just has to be a type signature. Isn't that right, Sarah?
Yes.
And date.
I got it. Thank you.
Oh, you already got it. You were faster than me. Excellent.
Thanks, Superintendent Mason.
Would
Thanks,
anyone
Sarah.
else
Appreciate
like
that.
a copy? Okay. And I did go ahead and put my email address in the chat. So if you want to click right on it, it'll allow you to send from there.
I wanted to put up the agenda just so you can see that that is the last step for today, but prior to adjournment. So want to make sure that you have everything you need in order to be able to complete those forms and get those submitted.
I'll keep an eye on my email just so I can have a sense of when they're completed, but we're happy to provide this time. And then if you think of any questions in the meantime, I'm sure that Rhonda and Mickey would be able to help you, or they may ask anyone on the call.
Sarah, can I just clarify really quickly?
Yes.
So on the findings, did we say you could have a typed signature on that?
Yes. Yes, you may have a typed signature and it may be sent to us through an electronic format. So it makes it a little bit more convenient to be able to provide that back to us. Thank you.
And then the sub reimbursement form can be sent back electronically as well?
Yes, to my email. That would be perfect. And we'll get those taken care of right away.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
don't want to rush anything, but as long as everyone has access to those forms and you're able to have Sarah's email address there to return those, once you are finished and have shared that, I think we have to entertain a motion for adjournment. But Rhonda, do you recommend, is there anything else we do prior to that adjournment?
I don't believe so, Mickey. I believe we just need to make sure everyone who's been in attendance completes the forms, whether it be 2 or 3, depending on if you need a sub. And we certainly appreciate your time and your expertise and your good questions and comments today. But I believe that is all we'll need to do, Mickey, other than to have maybe a formal adjournment.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you,
Superintendent.
Is there a
I
second?
have 2 decades of experience. That'd be my favorite motion.
That's great.
Did we have a second?
Jeannie, I'll second.
Didi.
Thank you.